Welcome, everybody. We'll just wait a minute so that people can join us. Welcome, everybody. We'll just wait another few seconds to begin so that people can join us. Thank you for being here. All right, welcome, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being with us this evening, and welcome. For those who don't know me, I'm Jennifer Mnookin, and I have the good luck of being dean here at UCLA School of Law, and I'm delighted to have you with us today for what is our fourth installment of our From the Frontline virtual summer series. And it's really my great pleasure to be bringing this to you. If you've joined us for earlier conversations, I think you know that you're going to be in for a rich treat and an interesting set of presentations and conversation. If this is your first, thanks for being here. Thank you for joining us this evening. As I think we all know, these are really extraordinarily challenging times in our country in so many ways. And I feel very lucky that at UCLA Law School, we have such an amazing faculty, alums, and friends of the school who are among the foremost experts in so many of the legal, social, and political issues that are at the heart of the conversation and the conversations that we need to be having today. During today's panel, we are, of course, marking the 100th anniversary of the 36th state ratifying the 19th Amendment. And that's, an extraordinarily important thing to be marking. And it gives us the chance to reflect on the challenges that the country still faces with respect to voter rights and voter suppression, topics that are operating differently than they were 100 years ago, but still remain extraordinarily relevant today. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists who have agreed to join us for this symbolic anniversary and this important moment. I'm going to introduce them extremely briefly in far less detail than they deserve. You can click for bigger bios of each of them, and we'll also send some materials and some supplementary materials afterwards for those who might want more reading or information. But I'm going to run through our phenomenal panelists very quickly. First, I'd like to introduce Ellen DuBois, Professor Emeritus here at UCLA in the College History Department. Professor DuBois is a pioneer of modern US women's history, and she's truly one of the foremost experts on the history of women's suffrage here in the United States. She's the author of many books, including Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, which was published earlier this year. And for those of you who are LA Times readers, you may have seen today's op-ed on topics related to what we're talking about this evening as well. Next, I'd like to introduce Salinda Lake, the founder of Lake Research Partners and one of the nation's leading political pollsters and an expert on women voters. Over the course of her tremendously distinguished career, Celinda has worked with Democratic National Convention, AFL-CIO, Human Rights Campaign, and Emily's List, just to name a few. We're really exceptionally lucky to have Celinda take time away from her role as a pollster for the Biden presidential campaign because, she has a few other things going on this week as well. So thank you, Celinda, for joining us. I'd then like to introduce Kathay Feng, the National Redistricting Director at Common Cause, a nonpartisan organization working to protect voting rights at the federal, state, and local levels. As it happens, my first internship when I was in college was at Common Cause. So there you go. Kathay, who also happens to be a proud UCLA law alum, has led Common Cause's work to challenge partisan and incumbent gerrymandering and state-based organizing around ballot initiatives and legislation, as well as to helping to create new platforms for community-based redistricting. So thank you so much for coming back to UCLA. I'm then also pleased to introduce Celinda Vázquez, who serves as Vice President of Public Affairs for Planned Parenthood here in Los Angeles. In addition to her role at Planned Parenthood, Celinda also serves on the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls. And we're very grateful to have you with us today as well, Celinda. Finally, we have joining us a recent graduate of UCLA Law School's David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy, and a superstar recent graduate, if I can say so myself, Sonni Waknin, class of 2020, who serves as the Managing Legal Fellow at the UCLA Voting Rights Project, which is housed within the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, and which works to ensure voter access across the country with a particular focus on local communities. During her time at UCLA Law School, Sonni was a star. She was remarkable in her efforts to organize UCLA law students to serve as poll workers in the 2018 election, to organize a 2019 protection call center at UCLA Law School. She was one of the biggest advocates for why our students will not be in class this year on election day. We've created it as a public service day, and she was one of the powers behind advocating for that kind of change. So we're proud of what she did with us, and we're proud of what she's doing now, and we're delighted to have you with us as well. So without further ado, let's begin. Professor DuBois, you've got the floor. Thank you.
Okay, start my watch. Well, I have 10 minutes to cover 75 years, so let me get started. The first thing to say is the obvious one, which is that it took an incredibly long time for women to get the right to vote. In some ways, this should have happened, as it did for Black men, in the aftermath of the Civil War. The very term suffrage carries with it, it is a bit antiquated. It was a 19th century term. It just doesn't work very well for later years. And in fact, suffragists changed the name of their movement to Votes for Women because suffrage had such a sort of musty smell to it. I want to say, start by saying something about the news today. Suffrage is never too far away from the news. And today, the President of the United States decided to pardon Susan B. Anthony. Well, what was that all about? In 1872, hundreds of women around the country, looking at the 14th Amendment, because it said that all persons were citizens and all citizens had equal rights and privileges, and therefore it seemed fairly obvious to them that voting was a right of national citizenship. They went to their polling places, and that's what Susan B. Anthony did in 1872. She was arrested for being allowed to cast her vote. It was a federal crime, part of the 1870 Enforcement Act that came out of the 15th Amendment. She was found guilty in an extraordinary trial run by a Supreme Court justice who dismissed the jury and declared that she was guilty because the only issues were, was she a woman and did she vote? And since both were obvious. Now, what is it, 50 years later, Trump has pardoned her. I don't think he has any idea what her crime was. Her crime was to vote because she believed that all national citizens had the right to vote. There is a little bit of buzz going on that the real reason he did this is that there is a group called the Susan B. Anthony list. Now, as we listen to that, we watch Susan B. Anthony turn over in her grave, because the Susan B. Anthony list argues that Anthony was somebody who opposed reproductive rights and would have opposed the right to abortion for modern women. It's just not true. Okay, let us jump forward. So why did it take such a long time? I guess I would talk about, well, perhaps three reasons. One is that the Constitution is not always, history does not always open the constitutional door to change. If you look at your little pocket Constitution, you will find that constitutional amendments, for the most part, are grouped in certain periods when there's a lot of radical change. In the 1860s, those were the three amendments, the three Reconstruction amendments. And then, and this is what Stanton and Anthony said when they opposed the fact that women were not included in the 15th Amendment, the constitutional door slammed shut. But for the next, until the 19 teens, no other constitutional amendments were enacted. When a new set of constitutional amendments were enacted in what's called the Progressive Era, the door opened again for women's suffrage. And it is under those circumstances that the 19th Amendment, which was originally supposed to be the 16th Amendment, but the 19th Amendment was passed. So the first reason it took so long is because there was no possibility for a constitutional amendment during the reactionary last decades of the 19th century. The second reason was the one that I think our audience would expect, which is just wildly coursing sexism in the society and the notion that women had no capacity to be voters. They weren't independent-minded. They were too emotional because, you know, men are not emotional. And it was those kinds of arguments that were often very much made in public. One of the arguments I should particularly point out here that got stronger and stronger in the late 19th, I'm just looking here, the late 19th and early 20th century is that if women got the right to vote, horrors, Black women would get the right to vote. And since Southern states, former Confederate states, had done everything possible to remove Black men under their control from the right to vote, they were not going to open the door to Black women, who they knew would be a lot more difficult to disfranchise than Black men. So that is a big, big reason. And then the third reason, and this is something that I feel like I learned from my book, is that the dominant political parties, especially the party in power, especially the party that had the reputation for being the more liberal or progressive party, was not really in favor of women's suffrage. This was the case of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln in the 60s and 70s, 1860s and 70s, and the Democratic Party in the 1910s, Woodrow Wilson's Democratic Party. They were opposed because women, being half of the population of all classes, of all races, of all regions, were absolutely unpredictable as voters. And they couldn't be expected to be controlled by the party in power. And so to allow them to enter the electorate would be to create a system of enormous chaos for political control by the existing parties. And for that reason, it was never, shall we say, it was never under any party's, it was never to the benefit of any party to enfranchise women. I want to spend my last few minutes saying something about the years after 1920. I'm actually not going to say anything about the long struggle of Black women to realize the right to vote as inscribed in the Constitution. What I do want to say is how long it took for women as the entirety, basically the whole group of women, not just those who were reformers and activists, for the great bulk of women to accommodate themselves to political activity, to learn how to operate, and to learn how to operate on behalf of their own interests. And that doesn't really happen until the mid-1970s, when something called the gender gap appears. I know that Celinda is going to be talking about the gender gap now, because nothing could be more important in the current political environment than that. One other final aspect of the slow development of women's political presence in the years after the 19th Amendment is the slow process of women taking political office, particularly at the national level. Um, uh, at the end of the first decade of suffrage, I think I don't know, there are about 10 women who were in the House of Representatives. The number never really goes up very far until, as I said, the 1970s. And looking at the Senate, the first woman elected to hold the office on her own was in the 1930s. She was a New Deal Democrat from Arkansas. Eventually, she left the office to a young whippersnapper named William Fulbright. And then the second was a very different kind of Republican than we currently know, Margaret Chase Smith in the 1950s. The first senator to call out Senator McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, for his anti-communism and his for attacks on democracy. When we get now to the time we're in, to the presidential nominating process that we've just seen, and to the election as we face it now, we know that this atmosphere of sexism, which is ginned up by hostile politicians and by certain media phenomenon, is a tremendous obstacle to women. So women are nasty, they're emotional, they're insufficiently aggressive to hold important national office, or they're too aggressive to hold national office. And it is these kinds of situations which we knew terribly from 2016 that are a major obstacle that women still face. 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for fitting a lot into your 10 minutes. Salinda Lake, you're up next. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. And I'm delighted to be here. And really, I learned so much. I'm going to go out and buy my copy of Suffrage as soon as I'm offline after this meeting. So thank you for having me. So I'm a political pollster, and I'm going to talk about the gender gap and women's votes with an eye particularly to today. And as the previous speaker said, the gender gap, the difference in men and women's voting behavior, emerged in the late 70s, and then 1980, the Ronald Reagan election was very, very catalytic to that. And since 1980, you see women voting more Democratic than men. And that has been true in every major group of women. So Black women vote even more Democratic than Black men. Latinas vote more Democratic than Latino men. And for every group, that is true. There are other gaps as well, though, and women are not monolithic, and the amount of difference between men and women's voting is not guaranteed. And in fact, there are a number of gaps that are even bigger than the gender gap. The gender gap, depending on how you measure it, ranges around 13 points, 20 points. And before COVID, we looked like we were going to have a record gender gap because men and women were really disagreeing about Donald Trump. Now a lot of men are following women and thinking, yeah, maybe Donald Trump isn't doing such a great job. Particularly, he's not the right kind of leader for the COVID era. There is a marriage gap. Married voters vote much more Republican than unmarried voters, and that's true for men and women. But unmarried women, particularly under 55, are one of the most Democratic constituencies. There's an education gap. The more education you have as a woman, the more Democratic you vote. Having a post-college degree, postgraduate degree is the most Democratic cohort, but college-educated women are voting significantly more Democratic than non-college educated women among whites. And in fact, white non-college educated women voted solidly for Donald Trump in 2016. White college educated women, and in fact, all college educated women, had been voting very strongly for Hillary Clinton. And then at the very end receded a little bit over a lot of controversies, but they are a very Democratic voting constituency right now. We also see big differences by race, obviously, and differences by age and other demographics. So women voters, not monolithic, but all groups of women tend to be more Democratic. than their Republican counterparts. What is the gender gap rooted in? The gender gap is rooted in two basic long-term attitudes. One is the role of government. Women see a significantly larger role for government than men, and women tend to think that they personally might someday need a safety net program. Men think, we got this, we're handling it. And of course, we've seen how that works sometimes. But women, so role of government, a big difference between women and men. The second, and we're really seeing that play out right now, is style of leadership. And that was the origin of a lot of the gender gap around Donald Trump. And women thought that Donald Trump is too egotistical, too chaotic, won't listen to anybody, won't listen to experts, doesn't have a plan. What was really revolutionary around the leadership style of Donald Trump was the COVID period. Because what happened is, for a long time, voters, men and women, particularly white men and women, said, well, Donald Trump is, we knew we weren't electing a politician, we were getting a businessman, we saw his style on Apprentice. Why can't Melania get his darn phone out of his hands at midnight? But, we know he's not a typical politician. What happened with COVID is what women had thought was kind of a personal idiosyncratic style became a style of governing. And women first, followed now by a lot of men, thought this style does not fit this period. He cannot solve crises this way. He cannot bring this country together to move forward. And that has been a real origin of the gender gap. But even back in 1980, women thought that Ronald Reagan would be too trigger happy, too eager to go to war, too aggressive in the foreign policy arena. So style of leadership has been at the root of the gender gap for quite some time. The other thing that is very, very important about women is voting and whether or not they vote. And women in all groups now turn out at higher rates than their male counterparts, and they have for quite some time, since the 1980s. Working outside the home was a major catalyst to women's political participation and their independence. They're forming their own point of view, having their own sources of information. But that said, in 2016, there were 43 million women missing from the electorate, 43 million women who didn't vote. And they would have voted for Hillary Clinton in bigger numbers than the electorate did. So one of the things that is very, very important as we face the 2020 election is turning out the vote. But again, both parties have their female constituencies. You'll see the Republicans really try to get out the vote in terms of born-again Christian women, Republican women. Democrats try to get out the vote in terms of millennials, women of color, single women. The key swing voting group for the 2020 elections is a group that I would call the Guardian women. These are 26% of the electorate. They are the protectors. They protect their families, they protect their neighborhoods, they are involved in taking care of children and aging relatives, and they are a key swing electorate, very ticket splitting, very independent. The last thing I have to say about women, women vote for women. Now, not universally, but if you want to turn out women and if you want to get more women votes, it helps to nominate women. And the Democrats have been much more aggressive about that than the Republicans, in part because our primaries are 58% female, while the Republican primaries are only about 45% female. So when we nominate women candidates, and when they do as well, women tend to vote more for those candidates by a small margin, but it still makes a difference. So what's going to happen in the 2020 elections? Well, I will tell you, it will be up to the women. It will be depending on how much they turn out and how different they vote from their male counterparts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting and powerful to hear about the differences across gender, but also all the subgroups. Really, really interesting. Next up, we'd like to hear from Kathay Feng.
So I want to talk about the intersection between race and gender. And in many ways, I think it's important to know the past in order to understand what's going on in the present. What was happening 100 years ago? To layer onto what Ellen was talking about with the women's suffrage movement, the 1920s were a time of great change in population shifts. The census had just been taken, and there was an active debate in Congress about whether seats should be reapportioned at all to states based on changes in the population. What were those two shifts in population? One was that our immigration to the United States had reached historic peaks in the late 1800s and early 1900s. First with waves of Asian immigrants, and then with waves of Eastern European immigrants. And each time those populations reached large numbers, they were met with fierce anti-immigrant laws, lynchings, and attacks. And again, some of those we will see in parallels that are happening today. The other great population shift was what was happening with African Americans as they moved from the South to the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. Between 1910 and 1940, 1.5 million African Americans moved from the South to escape lynchings, Jim Crow segregation, and ultimately to seek better economic opportunities for their families. Our country has created laws at that time that de facto disenfranchised Blacks, barred Native Americans and Asian Americans from even becoming citizens, and created real barriers to new immigrants who were darker skinned, Eastern Europeans from Italy and Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans from places like Italy and Poland from being able to even come into the country. So we saw, even though the Civil War had been fought and technically the 14th and 15th Amendment had been passed to grant enfranchisement and free Black peoples from slavery, the Jim Crow laws that reacted to that newfound freedom and the supposed enfranchisement that were imposed throughout the South, but even in parts of the West, imposed things like literacy rules, grandfather rules, poll taxes, and if that didn't work, outright violence on any Black person who attempted to try to vote. So in reality, by the 1920s, even though you had the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, there was in fact no ability by people of darker skin to be able to cast a ballot. Chinese were denied immigration under the Chinese Exclusion Act. We had immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe who were placed for the first time in 1924 under extreme quotas. And there was a new law in 1924 that was passed that said, if you're an immigrant from Asia, or specifically, they came up with a grandfather rule that said, if you have gained entry and you are a person who by virtue of race or nationality is ineligible for citizenship, you can't come into the country, right? So there are all these laws that are being passed, like literacy laws, grandfather rules, entry taxes, voting poll taxes, that are essentially excluding a large swath of our population based on race or immigration status or a combination of both from being able to participate. This is all happening in the 1920s. So what's happening when the 1920s census is taken? What do you do about the fact that the population is changing significantly because of that great migration north and the influx of immigrants from parts of Asia, Eastern and Southern Europe into our northern cities and our western cities? If you're a congressperson from Kansas, you might be trying to block the reapportionment of House seats for the next decade. You might be trying to exclude Negroes and uncivilized aliens from being counted for apportionment purposes. If you're in Congress, you might be trying to debate this long enough so that after the 1920s census is taken, you can drag your feet long enough that apportionment doesn't happen for another decade. So if you're in Congress using seats that were drawn based on the 1910 census, you can last all the way through 1930 without any change in population to your district. What's happening today? There's a lot of things that are resonant from that 1920s, 100 years past, right? We have a power structure that is being challenged to open up, to redistribute power to people who are actively being denied the votes. And at the same time, we have institutionalized power that is pushing hard to dismantle voting rights, to essentially create new Jim Crow voting barriers, to manipulate the census, apportionment, and redistricting, to look backwards at populations the way they were, and to exclude the way that our populations are growing today. So let's talk quickly about that. Key protections of the Voting Rights Act were dismantled in 2013. What did that directly lead to? In 2014, when Celinda talked about large numbers, millions of women not participating in the vote, many of those were not participating in the vote because voter suppression laws were then allowed to be passed that had been blocked by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Things like voter ID requirements for the first time, list purging that fell heaviest on Black and minority registered voters, including women, elimination of early voting and same-day voting that allowed for people who are not registered already, or people who had moved, or people who had changed their names to be able to vote immediately, were eliminated in states like North Carolina. We saw the erection of new Jim Crow barriers, which frankly, if you look at what's happening today, they've just been exacerbated by COVID. So take the fight over the ballots by mail. In California, our state has decided to mail every single registered voter who's active a ballot in the mail without request, right? Because we know that it's going to be very difficult for people to vote in person. It's like North Carolina, you have to have a witness to be able to even request an absentee ballot. And in states like Mississippi, you have to have a notary and go before the court to get a ballot even mailed to you. Otherwise, you basically have to make a choice to stand in line and risk your life in order to cast that ballot. In fact, the ballot battle, the battle over which polling locations stay open, the battle to remove drop boxes, the battle to remove post office drop boxes, the dismantling of the Postal Service, all of these are direct attacks that you can see as ways to limit who can cast a ballot that echo the kind of racism and sexism that was predominant in the 1920s. Today, we see that attempts to manipulate census, apportionment, and redistricting by doing things like trying to cut back on the time to enumerate, excluding immigrants and non-citizens from apportionment and redistricting, just to create a partisan and racial advantage. As we think about the legacy of the 19th Amendment, we have to ask this question. In any movement to align power, who is centered in that movement and who is marginalized? And as we look to try to dismantle the kinds of laws that have been institutionalized to cement sexism and white supremacy, we need to ask how those laws have been used to preserve power and what we need to do to change them so that new people can come into the enfranchisement.
Thank you very much. And thank you for directing us to think about both intersectional dimensions and also the many ways that voter suppression takes place and the ways that limitations can be structured and have particular effects on subpopulations and communities in deeply unfair ways. Before I turn to Celinda Vázquez, I just want to say that people are doing a great job, our speakers are doing a great job of sticking to their time limits, which means that we should have a few minutes for questions. We won't have a ton of time, but I want to encourage you, our audience members, there is a Q&A box, and if you'd like to put in a question, we'll do our best to get to at least a few. Next up, Celinda Vázquez.
Thank you, Dean, and it's just a pleasure to be with all of these panelists here this evening. As I was thinking about today's conversation, I actually remembered that I have my own mother's voting ID card here from 1960 when she was able to vote for the first time in Brooklyn, New York in Kings County. And she migrated from Puerto Rico in the late 50s and was able to cast her first vote at the age of 22. And something actually that we know, that was my lived experience and my family's lived experience, but something that actually Salinda Lake's research showed a couple of years ago around one of our key states right now at play, which is Florida. There were many Puerto Ricans that did move from the island to the mainland just recently after the horrific impact that Hurricane Maria had on the island. And so it takes people, in particular marginalized communities, a while to accommodate and to get food on the table and to really understand how to vote. So I am here representing the great organization of Planned Parenthood, in particular Planned Parenthood Advocacy Project, Los Angeles County Action Fund. I have a couple of hats. So that's the C4 PAC hat, electoral hat. I also work for the 501c3 direct service organization. And also I'm a commissioner on the status of women and girls for the state of California. And so right now, this is one of the most important, and we always say this, but really, truly, this cycle is one of the most important election cycles of our lifetime. And so what's at stake right now is reproductive health care. It is immigration rights. It is Black lives. It is education and distance learning. And what are we doing in this pandemic to ensure that children are not left behind, the children that don't have access to devices and Wi-Fi, whose parents are essential workers. At Planned Parenthood, we are serving on the 501c3 side, patients that absolutely need just basic access to reproductive health care. And that's what's at stake at this election is basic health care. And basic health care is reproductive health care. Education is at stake. The environment is at stake. Again, policing, police brutality. And while we are celebrating today the vote, the right to vote, the 100th celebration, we know that when that happened 100 years ago, there were then so many people that were left behind, because the right to vote does not mean you actually have the access to vote. It also is true for reproductive health care, for the patients that seek access at Planned Parenthood health centers every day. If you have the right to reproductive health care and abortion in the Constitution, it does not actually mean that you are able to actualize that, depending on where you live, who you are, what you look, the skin color that is on your body. And so right now, Planned Parenthood is doing everything that we can on the 501c4 side and the 501c3 side to serve the women and men and teens and families and people that come through the doors in this pandemic in particular. The demand has not decreased. In fact, during this pandemic, it was very unfortunate to see early on that in states where there were not women leaders and women that understood the women and elected officials that understood the importance of reproductive health care. During this pandemic, while the state of California was actually deeming abortion access as an essential care, there were states, about a dozen states, that deemed abortion care as non-essential. And so what we know and what's at stake is that our reproductive health care is at stake. Our livelihood is at stake. Basic health care is at stake. And right now in California, we have a tremendous opportunity to continue to be the leaders in this space, and also really continue to fight for all of our other states in which essential care is not abortion and reproductive health care is not deemed essential. And simply put, we do that by voting. We do that by registering folks to vote, educating all of the folks that could be eligible to vote. And I think, Kathay, you were the one who said in one of our conversations a few days ago, there are people that are eligible to vote, there are people that can vote, and there are going to be people's votes who are counted, and people's votes that are not going to be counted. So right now at Planned Parenthood, we are doing census work on the 501c4 side, in particular in Los Angeles, to make sure those undercounted communities are being counted. We know there are a couple of spots in Los Angeles, in particular in the county, Antelope Valley, some parts of San Fernando Valley, and some parts of East Los Angeles that are undercounted. And so we are focusing on those areas to make sure that we have an accurate count. We know what's at stake when there is not an accurate count. That means federal funds will not flow to the state of California, which in turn means services, social services, public education, health and human services, reproductive healthcare services are at stake. And we also know that congressional districts are at stake. Probably 1 to 2 congressional districts in the Los Angeles County congressional delegation are at stake at this very moment. So Planned Parenthood is actively working to get an accurate census count done. We will also be working extremely hard to ensure that voters understand what the new system is, given COVID, given all of these attacks on our simple US Postal Service mail-in ballot protocols, and what's really at stake with the candidates, and who really are the candidates that are going to be championing reproductive health care and really championing the patients that Planned Parenthood serve. In Los Angeles County, our patients represent the demographics that are Los Angeles County, a beautiful, diverse, and complex community. And that is who we serve. But we have to make sure that the candidates are reflective also of that community and also understand the needs. And that's what Planned Parenthood is doing right now. Birth control, reproductive health care, access to abortion, all of these really are allow women and families to achieve really equality in their pursuit of justice. And so we are going to do everything we can in this cycle in partnership with all of you actually that are here in this panel to ensure that not only women get out to vote, but their families. And we know in research actually that Salinda Lake has done that women are the anchors in their families, in particular in women, communities of color. This is true in Latinx families. This is true in, the research has shown in Black families, that the women are really anchors in guiding and really educating their families on how to vote. And so we are part of that. We have everything to gain and we have everything to lose in this election cycle. So with that, I will close up and of course have opportunities for Q&A if we do in a few seconds.
Thank you so much, Celinda, and thanks for that incredibly moving display of your mother's voting card, and also for making so clear what's at stake in an accurate count and in including the full community in all of its splendid diversity. Sonni, you're up next.
Thank you. I just want to touch upon kind of what everyone has said, which is really that 100 years later, the 19th Amendment's promise has not really been fulfilled. And we know that because there is a real lack of jurisprudence. So everything that Kathay touched upon where we come to these new Jim Crow era laws, we know that they present burdens on voters. And the 19th Amendment tracks the 15th Amendment, it tracks the 24th Amendment and the 26th Amendment. It has this abridge or deny language. Yet there's a real lack of jurisprudence around the 19th Amendment and voting rights. And that reason is because there's a lack of social science research or research in general about how these laws are particularly burdensome to women. So we know that in social science that it's clear that people with less means, less resources, less socioeconomic status, they have less access to voting. And while women have higher turnout, we've never really studied whether the lack of means and resources and socioeconomic status that we know presents a burden to voters is particularly burdensome to women, who we know also, are the ones who are generally lacking the means and socioeconomic status due to societal structures. And so I really advocate that we need to have more social science research and more research in general about how women are burdened, particularly by voter ID laws, by these new Jim Crow laws, by voter purges, by closing of polling locations, and trying to flesh out the promise of the 19th Amendment through jurisprudence. There should be more 19th Amendment cases. I think there's only 2 I could kind of think of off the top of my head, which is crazy. Congress has the power and authority to pass laws to protect women's vote, and we really just haven't seen anything in terms of women in general getting their rights protected. I then want to turn over to what students can do, what people on this call can do, and I want to reiterate how important the census is. The census is extremely important, and we need people to fill it out. And so the thing that you can do right now before thinking about the 2020 election is go and make sure that not only you filled out your census, your family members filled out their census, and then go into your own community and hit the ground and make sure everyone filled out their census, and really advocating to people that the census is safe, that they're not going to use the census against you, that your data is not going to be stolen or not going to be used by the administration. We know the administration is trying very hard to miscount and mess up the census. And so, just really hammering the census, and also advocating for your local election officials to spend money on making sure that people fill out the census. It's not just us, it's also lobbying our local officials to make sure that the count is accurate. And then also I want to talk about helping others understand absentee ballot laws. And so we're using vote by mail as this kind of cure-all, and hopefully it will help people. But the news about the USPS aside, we need to make sure that people understand absentee ballot laws. They're particularly complicated. Sometimes you assume that you can return them on election day and you can't. So law students are particularly situated, and lawyers in general, to go and understand the very nuanced laws that tell you what is required of returning an absentee ballot. As Kathay mentioned, some states have notary requirements, and ensuring that you're telling people who have absentee ballots, saying, hey, these are the rules for an absentee ballot. I then want to turn to UCLA specific and what students can do. I think everyone on this call can do, but students particularly, because as Dean Mnookin, you have said you have the day to go do public service. Please sign up to be a poll worker with Los Angeles County, and stop polling place consolidation. We saw long lines in the primaries, and partially it was because polling places were consolidated, because not only did we need larger polling locations, that's the thought with COVID, but also poll workers tend to be old and older, and they tend to be over 65. And so you had a lot of people who are in this at-risk category for COVID-19 who don't feel comfortable being poll workers. And so we're advocating for people to go be poll workers who are young, who don't have anything to do that day, either during the early voting period or during election day, or alternatively, go be a poll watcher and sign up with Kathay in California and with Election Protection, which is a great national organization that we've had at UCLA generally, to go to different states and make sure that you are helping voters at the polls. There's this thing called the RNC versus DNC Dissent Decree. It was to stop people from having these kind of voter intimidation poll worker projects. That consent decree is no more. And so this is going to be really the first election where we see voter intimidation and private organizations advocate for voter intimidation full force. And so students who have the day off and who think that they can make a difference either by being a poll worker or a poll watcher can really make a huge difference for voters on the ground. And especially we know that voter intimidation programs disproportionately affect voters of color. So going out there and ensuring that there are people intimidating voters at the polling location. And then the last thing I want to say is also, ensuring the right to vote means that young people care about the right to vote, and young people are learning about voting rights. And so supporting students who work at the UCLA Voting Rights Project, there are students who are now taking the clinic at UCLA Law and doing the work, and just making sure that students have access to voting rights opportunities and to learn about it at school.
Thank you so much, Sonni, for both giving those very concrete things that people on this call can do to help protect the right to vote, and for also giving us some sense of the jurisprudence and, frankly, its underdevelopment, considering where we are. So we do have a few minutes for questions, but we don't have questions on our Q&A. So I want to take this full circle. I mean, this is a historical day, and we've covered both some history and some of the present. But I want to come back to Ellen. And I like to think that UCLA, we're a national law school, even a global law school, but we're also Los Angeles' law school. And I wonder if you can share with us a little bit about the story of the creation of the right to vote in California and the importance of Los Angeles in that story. You wrote about this a little bit in your LA Times op-ed, which I hope everybody will go out and buy your book and also read your op-ed today. But I'd love if you could just tell us a little bit about the politics of Los Angeles then, and then if we have time, somebody can link that to the politics of voting in Los Angeles today.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I good?
Yes.
Thank you for this opportunity. Okay, so the crucial thing to understand is that I'm not sure which of the other participants spoke about how the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendment all have the same language. Was it Kathay?
I think it was Sonni.
Sonni, right, and pointed out that there had been really very little social science research to show how actually forms of voter suppression work against women and therefore violate the 19th Amendment. I've lost my, for a moment. Yes, but there's even, I think, a more basic point to make, which is those three amendments leave control over the right to vote in the hands of the states. As Sonni pointed out, they're all posed in the negative. States can't disfranchise. And we know, you lawyers and law students know, that the court allowed all kinds of devices to get around the 15th Amendment. Instead of saying people were disfranchised by race, color, or previous condition, they were disfranchised because they couldn't pay a poll tax. These were surrogates for race. Even the advocates of Black suffrage at the time knew that the 15th Amendment was a very weak protection for Black suffrage. So having said that, I do want to say, and I put this as I can in my book, that through the mid-1870s, women suffragists worked hard to get a very different kind of amendment passed, one that would have linked the right to vote in an affirmative way with national citizenship. This failed, and we have been paying the price for this ever since. So I think there are ways that some states are beginning to sort of reformulate their own forms of enfranchisement and link it to, in an affirmative way, to citizenship. But as it currently stands, it is a remarkable fact that the right to vote has very little protections in the Constitution. Having said that, by leaving the right to vote at the state level, this meant that for the next 30 or 40 years, through the late 19th and early 20th century, suffragists actually turned to the states to enfranchise women. And through many of the Western states, they were successful. In 1911, that means that California was the 11th state in which male voters agreed to amend their state constitution. And when they did that, to remove the word male or they might have added the word women, I'm not sure. All of those women in California had full voting rights up to and including President of the United States. So by about 1915, something like 4 million women in the United States had the right to vote for President of the United States. And these women's votes became an important lever in the renewed battle for a federal constitutional amendment, because politicians could pay a price if they angered all of these women who could vote. That didn't go into too much detail about California, but it certainly said what the constitutional situation of California voting amendment to the Constitution of the state was based on.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. And for those of you who do want to read some of the California stories, check out Ellen's op-ed from today, and you'll see that LA served as, it was actually thanks to Los Angeles in part that the LA voters narrowly favored the women's right to vote, as opposed to San Francisco voters that
and San Francisco.
Right, exactly. So I just thought that was, I grew up in the Bay Area, but I'm now in Angelino, and I just thought that was
right.
That was worth
and they
sharing.
all think there's so much, so all that, and where they're not, we are.
We do have one question. It's such a big question that we can't really take it up in just a couple of minutes, but does anybody want to say something about voting rights litigation and the practicalities of that, including acquiring evidence from government entities such as the Secretary of State, and what kinds of issues arise in voting rights practice and some of the challenges? Does anybody want to speak to that?
I'll
Kathy?
take a stab. It's gigantic.
Right,
Let's see, am I
the 2-minute
unmuted? Yeah.
version.
Okay, two-minute version is, you've got the Voting Rights Act that protects minorities and also language minorities from discrimination. And it used to be that there was a section called Section 5 that not only allowed proof of discrimination, after it happened, but also a measurement of whether proposed law or policy was discriminatory before it could be enacted. And you had to kind of get approval from the Department of Justice before it could be enacted, right? That is actually the law that was dismantled. And as a result, a whole slew of voter suppression laws and practices came into place around 2012, right? And that's where we started to see this turnaround of who was allowed to participate in voting. How do you prove it? Yes, you absolutely are looking at patterns and practices that may be coming from secretaries of state. A lot of times those practices are all the way down to the counties, and you're doing a lot of discovery. You're also bringing in experts who are looking at whether or not there are patterns that you can sort of tell from the way the numbers play out. And then the third area, frankly, in a recent case where we managed to strike the citizenship question from the census, we actually came across a trove of documents that were the secret documents of a redistrictor, Thomas Hoffler, who revealed that the only reason that he wanted to exclude non-citizens was for partisan and racial advantage, and the Supreme Court denied it. So sometimes you find intent smoking gun. A lot of times you're proving it by statistics and disparate impact.
Wow, that was a great whirlwind 90-second introduction on a topic that could be its own panel. But we are just about out of time. I want to thank our panelists. This has been, I think, a really terrific blend of both history and the contemporary, which is perfect for marking this moment. This is still an issue that's so very much with us. I mean, I think about my own grandmothers who, when they were born in Missouri, certainly neither of them had the right to vote. I think Missouri was about a 1918 state or so, and they were both born before that, or 1919. I don't know. Ellen would know. I don't know the exact details. And we still don't have anything close to a population proportional number of women in office. We've never had a woman president. We've never had a woman vice president, but we've got a candidate. And yet we've also seen a lot of change. And so it's a time when we can reflect both on how much has changed and how much hasn't. on all of the incredible obstacles and the ways that there are still limits to the practical effect of the right to vote, ways in which the vote is being suppressed in all kinds of ways in which people that we wish would care don't always. And yet, when we compare this to 100 years ago, certainly there's forms of access that are significantly greater and ways into the conversations that are absolutely transformed. I'm struck too that we're having this conversation in the midst of a pandemic. And I think about the flu pandemic of 1918. And I think there's also space for a conversation. We need historians, because I certainly don't know the answer, but the question of how structural health challenges that are enormous and shape our universe can also shape our social structures. And I'm sure there are stories to be told there too. And so I leave you thanking you for being with us. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to all who are on this call. Thanks for being with us. And I very much hope that you will get out there and vote in November, and that you'll also consider playing a role in some of the ways that Sonni and others suggested today. Thanks very much, and have a terrific rest of your evening.